Hello, my name is Karen Stamm, and I'm the director of the Center for Workforce Studies at the American Psychological Association. In today's brief presentation, I'm going to talk about some psychology job opportunities in the future of work, so that you can get some ideas about some of the areas we anticipate are emerging and will be important in the future of psychology. In case you're interested in information specific to the psychology workforce and education pathways, please check out the APA Center for Workforce Studies website at apa.org/workforce. We have a number of research reports, data tools, fact sheets, and lots of great information to help you plan your career pathway. You can also reach out to us at cws@apa.org with any questions. We'd love to hear from you. Before I get into the content of today's presentation, I wanted to briefly touch on what is the outlook for the job markets. And yes, that is job markets with an S, there are more than one. And I also put in the time frame that I'm preparing this presentation. We're in June of 2022 right now as I'm speaking to you today. So keep that in mind, as there have been a lot of rapid changes in the economy, in the labor markets, and the timing is important for this kind of context. On the whole, the job market looks favorable for job seekers, as it did about a year ago. If I had to put a weather icon on it, I'd probably put a partly sunny icon. There are some indications that the labor market, at least for job seekers, is starting to cloud up a little bit. So keep an eye on that if you are on the job market. A couple things to keep in mind about the job markets are the Great Resignation, which is a phenomenon that we started hearing about in late 2021, where lots of people were leaving their jobs, in many cases for better opportunities, but in some cases without another job lined up. There's been more attention to burnout and its flip side of wellness in the workplace. And I'm pretty convinced that burnout is one of the many factors that's contributing to the Great Resignation. There's also some concerns about a looming recession that, as of June of 2022, looks like it might be on the horizon and will have some effect on the job markets. So, but again, the job market right now does look favorable for job seekers. There's many open positions, and there are some encouraging signs there. For today's presentation, I'm going to briefly discuss why I think the future of work is human. And I'm also going to go through 4 areas in psychology where we see some emerging trends for future job opportunities. These include technology, applied psychology, equity, and wellness or well-being. What I'm not going to talk about in today's presentation are some of the more common career pathways in psychology. Those would be practitioner or clinician roles, faculty and educators, researchers. There's lots of great resources and information out there if you're interested in these pathways. Instead, today, what I want to do is highlight some of these emerging areas that will help position you for the future. I very often focus on the human nature of work, and it's becoming clear that the future of work is human. What I mean by that is that there's value in a core set of human, essential, or transferable skills that are required in some unique combination for the successful performance of just about any job. The exact nature of these skills will vary depending on the duties and responsibilities of each position, but we do see very consistent patterns in these top human skills across different types of occupations. These skills are inherently and uniquely human. They take advantage of our human intelligence. They're also based in behavior, and they have foundations in psychology. As the field that studies behavior, that means if they're based in behavior as key skills, they're also grounded in psychology. So that means that you, as people who have backgrounds in psychology, are well positioned for the future. Some examples of human skills include communication, both written and oral communication, teamwork or collaboration, leadership and its close cousin of management, interpersonal relationships, and empathy, both of which are strongly foundational in psychology. And finally, critical thinking and problem solving, especially complex problem solving, which we're called on more and more frequently to use in our jobs. Human skills are currently resistant to technology or automation. And the reason why I say this is because of their complexity. I would not rule out a greater role for technology or automation at some point in the future, but I do think that's still a ways off. Technology and automation are really good with tasks that are repetitive or that have clear rules or outcomes. What humans are better at are these complex tasks that are not repetitive and do not have clear rules and outcomes. And again, this takes advantage of our human intelligence. Human skills are also durable and resilient. We see very consistent patterns in these top human skills, regardless of what point in time we are looking at, the types of positions we look at, the degree levels. The exact patterns vary a little bit, and sometimes the terms change. But overall, we do see very, very consistent patterns in top human skills. In the essence of time today, I'm not going to go over the top 20 skills for psychology degree holders, but there's a couple of links at the end of today's presentation if you're interested in taking a look at that research. So moving on to one of our 4 areas where there's some opportunities for psychology areas, the first one I want to take a look at is technology. One way to think about this is how humans use technology in their jobs. You can think about this as technology assisted or technology augmented work. I'll give you an example here that isn't necessarily work related, but given you're all here today in APA's job fair, this is something you might be familiar with. If you have a favorite job board, you might be able to set up alerts for open positions that meet certain criteria that you're interested in. And the job board will then send you an automatic alert when new positions become available that meet your criteria. This is an example of technology assisted work where the job board will do the job and the work of finding those jobs for you. And that frees up you as a human being to make a decision about whether you want to apply for that job. And there's lots of examples, if you think about it, in our jobs where technology replaces some of what we do, but not all of it, and helps us to free up our capacity to do more human work. You might also be thinking about how humans use technology in terms of remote work tools, virtual meeting platforms, and additional ways that we use technology. Specifically in psychology, we use technology at a growing rate as well. I have some examples listed here on today's slide. And again, this is not an exhaustive list, but some examples to get you thinking about how we use technology in the field of psychology. Telehealth services have become much more common in the last couple of years as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. Similarly, electronic health records have become more common in certain types of healthcare settings. Distance learning platforms for delivering education and educational services. Scaling up individual level approaches that takes what works well on a one-on-one basis and instead applies it to groups, organizations, communities, systems, and populations as a whole to have a greater impact. Mental health apps are an example of how we can scale up what works well at an individual approach and bring it to more people. Human factors research sits at the intersection of psychology and engineering and very often also uses technology. User experience design or UX design, you'll see that UX specifically for these kinds of positions, will often involve research on products to make sure you have meaningful and relevant products, and could sometimes use technology. In many cases it does. Would be good fits for people with a background in psychology. And 2 areas that are near and dear to me as a quantitative psychologist: artificial intelligence and data science, that take the foundations of statistics and scientific inquiry that are grounded in the fields of psychology, combine them with computer science, and use them to work with much richer and larger data sets in innovative ways. And that foundation in scientific inquiry is really important for applications for artificial intelligence and data science to make sure that we're posing the right questions. Now, given you're here today in APA's job fair, you've probably updated your CV recently. But if you haven't, you might want to think about making sure that you include your technology skills. It's very easy to overlook these skills, and yet they will bring you value as you're navigating the job search process. Another area where we anticipate some increasing roles for psychology is in the area of applied psychology. This is the branch of psychology that uses psychological research to solve real-world problems. If you find yourself asking a lot of questions that start with how or why, you are asking applied psychology questions. Again, I have some examples here on the slide that are not exhaustive, but will give you an example of applied psychology questions. Why do health, educational, and economic inequities exist? How do people interact with and understand technology? Going back to the themes of the last slide. How do we make sure that artificial intelligence does not cause harm? Because it has a lot of potential to do good, but if we're not careful, it could do some harm as well. How do organizations and systems change, which I'll touch on in the next two slides? How can psychology promote equitable hiring, which highlights psychology's role in HR functions? How can psychology address complex societal issues, such as systemic racism, climate change, gun violence, population health needs, and additional complex societal issues that have become very important in recent times? Another way for applied psychology to make an impact is through advocacy and public policy. This is where we bring psychological research to policymakers so that they in turn can use psychological research to address real-world policy issues. So if any of these areas around applied psychology sound interesting to you, you might be able to think of some of your own questions as well. I encourage you to pursue those options because we need more psychologists to do this kind of work than ever. The needs are greater and the impact is potentially very large. We've also seen some opportunities for equity roles. Anecdotally, we're hearing about growth in equity, diversity, and inclusion offices, either by organizations increasingly creating these offices, or in some cases, restructuring existing roles to include a greater focus on equity, diversity, and inclusion. There's been more attention to including diverse perspectives in the workplace and to creating inclusive work environments. Many organizations are looking at what they can do to address some of these equity, diversity, and inclusion issues. If you're interested in this kind of work, it might help to look beyond the job title and to examine the job description carefully to see if there's some kind of equity, diversity, or inclusion responsibilities in these positions. If you're looking for positions that have these kinds of qualifications, by doing so, you'll find more than just positions that are located within equity, diversity, and inclusion offices. Any kind of work around equity is complex and in many cases can require organizational change. It can require culture changes, transformation, building relationships, requires time and resources. And the successes of these initiatives cannot rest on the equity, diversity, inclusion offices alone. So in many places, everyone can contribute to equity. So that might be another way to think about that if this is something that interests you in your career pathways. And finally, another opportunity where we see some future trends is in employee wellness and well-being. Similar to equity, we've anecdotally been hearing about increases in employee wellness or well-being offices, either by creating and establishing new offices or restructuring existing roles to include a greater emphasis on employee wellness. There's a lot of examples in medical schools where this has been happening and has been expanded, and additional employers are looking at this as an important contribution and part of their workforces. Like I mentioned earlier, there's been more attention to burnout, I think in part because of the Great Resignation as one of the factors contributing to that, and employee mental health, and more resources devoted to ensure you have, you're paying attention to the well-being of your employees. It's important to recognize that there are effective individual level interventions, but when you're looking at burnout, you might also want to look at the organizational level and what changes you can make, not at the individual level, but at the organizational level to prevent burnout and to improve wellness in the workplace. Sometimes those organizational changes can have a bigger impact than just looking at the individual level. It's also important to look at what can organizations do to prevent, not only reduce burnout, but what can they do to prevent burnout more upstream before it becomes problematic and starts interfering with people's ability to work. Much like what we saw with equity, employee wellness and well-being initiatives often involve culture change, transformation, building relationships, communication, and time and resources. And much like equity as well, everybody can contribute to some of these initiatives. The successes are not dependent on the employee wellness and well-being offices alone. Everybody has a role to play in promoting employee wellness. So now that I've talked about a few areas that we see emerging in the field of psychology for future trends, Here are some actionable next steps for exploring your career options. One is to be self-reflective, or to the so-called know thyself principle. This is not a one-time process. This is something you should build into your career exploration process on an ongoing basis to make sure you have a good understanding of your skills, abilities, knowledge, interests, motivations, and values. By doing so, it will allow you to plan a career path that will align well with your skills, abilities, knowledge, interests, motivations, and values. Once you've done some of that self-reflection, then you can move forward in creating a plan. Research shows that if you write your plan down and you share it with somebody else, you're more likely to achieve your goals. I have a few resources here to help you develop a plan. One is APA's Individual Development Plan resource. It's a 5-step process that will guide you through this process of exploring your career options and generating a plan and then achieving your plan. If you're looking for a variety of jobs across the labor markets, a great resource is the ONET Job Profiles, which has an occupational profile for over 1,000 different occupations across the labor markets. You can search it in various ways by looking at skills, similar occupations, career clusters, bright outlooks. There's some skill assessment tools there as well to help you explore your career options. And if you're looking for information specific to the field of psychology, please do check out the APA Center for Workforce Studies website. That's the research that my team and I conduct to help understand the field of psychology. And finally, one thing I often recommend for people who are on the job market is to plan but adapt. It's okay if your goals shift. It's okay as during part of this process, you realize that the path you're on is not the right one and you need to make some adjustments. That's a normal process. It happens to many of us. So if it happens to you, you are certainly not alone. And ultimately, it will help you to seek out a career pathway that will provide successful, meaningful employment. Also, as a point of making you feel like you're not alone, many of us, even those of us who appear to have it all figured out, at one point did not know what our career pathways either, and we stumbled our way through it by making a series of constant small adjustments and small steps to move you towards the right path. I hope that you'll find your way into a successful, meaning career pathway as well. Here again are the resources that I mentioned on the previous slide, as well as those 2 links to monitor on psychology data points on top 20 skills for both psychology bachelor's degree holders and psychology graduate degree holders at the master's and doctorate level. Good luck in planning your career pathway. Be well, and thanks so much for joining today.